Marcus Carter, a middle-aged man with a sturdy build and a calm demeanor, stepped out of a small restaurant in downtown Atlanta. That evening, he had met up with former military comrades, enjoying a night filled with laughter and reminiscing about battlefield memories. The soldiers who had once stood together in life-or-death moments now shared the joys of peaceful lives. As he walked out, Marcus donned his worn jacket and headed toward the parking lot. The street was quiet, with only a few passers-by. Suddenly, he noticed the headlights of a police patrol car approaching. Thinking nothing of it, Marcus continued walking, but just as he reached for his car door, a cold voice rang out, "Stop right there. Hands up." Marcus turned to face Sergeant Ethan Powell, a white police officer whose eyes brimmed with suspicion. Ethan stepped out of the patrol car, one hand resting on the gun at his hip. Marcus remained calm and tried to smile. "Is there a problem, officer?" Ethan didn't respond immediately, staring at Marcus with a judgmental glare. "What are you doing here at this hour? This area's had a lot of car thefts. What are you planning to do with this vehicle?" Marcus frowned slightly. "This is my car. I just had dinner with friends. If needed, I can show you my papers." But Ethan didn't let Marcus explain. He stepped closer, his tone growing harsher. "You think I believe you? What are you doing here? Looking so suspicious." Marcus began to feel the sting of injustice but kept his composure. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. This is my car, and I'm just trying to go home." Ethan advanced further, pulling Marcus away from the car. To Marcus's surprise, he was shoved against the vehicle, his arms forcibly pinned behind his back. Without hesitation, Ethan cuffed Marcus in full view of a few passers-by. "You're resisting an officer. Sit tight while I run a check," Ethan barked. Humiliation surged through Marcus. He stayed silent, not wanting to escalate the situation. A bystander pulled out their phone and began recording the scene. Though Marcus knew he had done nothing wrong, he felt powerless against the blatant injustice. Sitting in the back seat of the patrol car, Marcus couldn't stop the memories of his childhood from flooding back. He recalled his early days living with his mother and younger sister in a poor neighborhood in South Chicago. From a young age, Marcus understood that the color of his skin made him a target for different treatment. He remembered being turned away from joining a basketball team because of an internal policy. He also recalled being stopped by a supermarket security guard despite doing nothing wrong. But the memory that stayed with him the most was of his mother, Eleanor, working herself to exhaustion to support her 2 children. She would often say, "Son, you have to be strong. Don't let them define who you are." Growing up in such an environment, Marcus learned early that he had to rise above it all to prove his worth. After graduating high school, he made the life-changing decision to join the military. In the military, Marcus faced countless challenges, not just physical but psychological. There were times when his white peers looked down on him, assuming he was only there because of diversity policies. But Marcus refused to give up. He worked tirelessly, completing every assignment with excellence, and slowly earned the respect of everyone around him. After 20 years of service, Marcus retired with the rank of colonel, a rare achievement for a black man. Returning to civilian life, he hoped for peace and sought ways to give back to his community. Ethan Powell, the man now handcuffing Marcus, grew up in a conservative family in a small town in Georgia. His father, a Vietnam War veteran, often instilled racist ideas in his son. "You've got to be wary of black people," his father would say. "They're the root of all the problems in this society." Ethan grew up hearing these words, and they became deeply ingrained in his mindset. When he joined the police force, Ethan felt empowered to enforce his worldview. He frequently stopped black drivers for looking suspicious and didn't hesitate to use force. But Ethan wasn't entirely evil. Deep down, he was a man shaped and distorted by the society and family that raised him. He had never questioned the beliefs he was taught, accepting them as undeniable truths. When faced with Marcus, Ethan didn't see a retired army colonel. He only saw a black man in a neighborhood he deemed dangerous. His prejudice clouded all sense of reason. When the video of the incident was uploaded online, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, thousands of shares and comments condemning Ethan's actions flooded social media. The media quickly picked up the story, reporting on it extensively, and human rights organizations expressed their outrage. Marcus was released after several hours in custody, but he refused to give any immediate interviews. He just wanted to go home and reflect on what had happened. However, his close friends advised him not to stay silent. Meanwhile, Ethan began to feel pressure from all sides. His colleagues started whispering about him. The police department launched an internal investigation, and his family was hounded by reporters. Ethan, however, refused to admit any wrongdoing, insisting he was simply doing his job. After a night of contemplation, Marcus decided he couldn't let the incident be swept under the rug. He filed a lawsuit against Ethan and the police department, not out of revenge, but to seek justice and prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. Marcus Carter woke up after a long night, his mind still heavy with thoughts about the injustice he had faced. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the pain of millions of black people who had endured discrimination in silence. Marcus decided to act, and his first step was to find an experienced lawyer specializing in cases of racial discrimination. Amanda Rodriguez, a talented attorney passionate about social justice, had already heard about Marcus's case through the news. When she received his call, she immediately agreed to meet. In her office, Amanda listened intently as Marcus recounted the events in detail. She not only felt his pain but also saw the determination in his eyes. "This isn't just a case," Amanda said, her voice charged with emotion. "This is an opportunity to challenge a system of injustice that has existed for far too long. But you need to be prepared. They won't give in easily." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "I've fought tougher battles. I'm ready." Amanda began preparing the lawsuit against Ethan Powell and the police department. Meanwhile, the department launched an internal investigation to quell public outrage. However, instead of uncovering the truth, they sought to protect Ethan by distorting the facts. Reports were altered, and evidence was hidden. Marcus and Amanda knew they were in for a long fight. In the days that followed, the pressure on Ethan Powell intensified. Videos of his actions were broadcast on national television, making him the target of widespread criticism. Ethan tried to ignore the threats and disdainful glances from his colleagues, but the strain at work and home grew heavier by the day. Ethan's wife, Rachel, became increasingly alarmed as neighbors and friends began distancing themselves. Their young son, frequently teased at school, would come home in tears. Rachel confronted Ethan in anger. "What have you done? Did you think this would all just blow over? You're tearing this family apart." Ethan, though still trying to appear steadfast, began to waver. He told himself he had only been doing his job, but deep down, he knew his actions had crossed the line. Meanwhile, Marcus wasn't immune to pressure either. Threats from extremist groups supporting Ethan started appearing in his mailbox. However, instead of backing down, Marcus used those letters as motivation to keep fighting. He began attending community meetings, sharing his story, and encouraging others to stand up against injustice. On a tense evening, Ethan sat alone in his living room, staring intently at the glass of whiskey on the table. Childhood memories flooded back, like an uncontrollable storm. Ethan grew up in a poor family on the outskirts of a small town in Georgia. His father, Frank Powell, a Vietnam War veteran, carried unhealed psychological wounds. Frank often unleashed his anger on Ethan and his mother, blaming them for all the misfortunes in his life. Many nights, Ethan would listen as his father ranted. "Black people are the reason America is falling apart. They're just a burden on society." As a young boy, Ethan didn't know right from wrong and unconsciously absorbed those words as truth. Growing up with such distorted beliefs, Ethan joined the police force under the guise of upholding the law. But in reality, it was about wielding the power he believed he deserved. His abuse of authority stemmed not only from prejudice but also from a deep-seated fear and weakness he constantly tried to hide. Tonight, sitting alone, Ethan began to question himself. Where did I go wrong? How did it come to this? But his self-reflection was quickly overshadowed by his pride and fear of losing everything. Amanda Rodriguez, with her expertise and sharp instincts, didn't rely solely on the video of the incident. She began digging deeper, looking for other victims of Ethan Powell's abuse of authority. Through interviews, she discovered that Marcus was far from an isolated case. A black woman named Linda recounted how Ethan had once stopped her simply because she was driving an old car and wearing modest clothing. Not only did he insult her, but he also threatened to arrest her if she didn't leave the area immediately. Like many others, Linda hadn't spoken out for fear of retaliation. A delivery driver named Jamal shared that Ethan had once pulled him over and conducted an unwarranted search of his vehicle. Afterward, Ethan threw Jamal's documents to the ground, forcing him to pick them up in humiliation. These testimonies allowed Amanda to build a compelling case, focusing not only on Marcus's incident but also on proving that Ethan Powell represented a larger systemic issue within the police force. Meanwhile, Marcus spent his time connecting with the community, encouraging people to join peaceful protests outside the police station. The crowd grew larger each day, holding signs demanding justice and systemic reform. From his office, Ethan watched the banners and the angry, determined faces of the protesters. He felt more isolated than ever. Yet, instead of confronting the truth, Ethan chose to retreat further, convincing himself that everything happening was a conspiracy against him. Marcus, despite facing numerous challenges, remained resolute. He knew the journey to justice would not be an easy one, but he wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for an entire community yearning for change. Amanda Rodriguez continued her investigation and uncovered internal records from the Atlanta Police Department. She discovered that Ethan Powell wasn't just an individual offender. He was a product of a deeply flawed system. Reports had been buried, victims ignored, and officers within the force seemed to cover for one another to protect the department's image. One day, Amanda received an anonymous call from a young officer named Daniel Foster. He revealed that he had witnessed Ethan Powell abusing his authority on multiple occasions, even resorting to violence in other incidents. Feeling guilty for staying silent for so long, Daniel agreed to meet Amanda and share what he knew. At a discreet coffee shop, Daniel recounted a series of incidents, including cases where Ethan and several senior officers had routinely altered reports to avoid investigations. He emphasized, "Ethan isn't the only one. This entire system is rotten. If you stop at just one person, nothing will change." Amanda was stunned by the revelations. She realized that this lawsuit wasn't just about holding Ethan accountable. It was about challenging an entire corrupt system. But it also meant that she and Marcus would face even greater challenges ahead. After weeks of preparation, the first trial of Ethan Powell began at the Atlanta City Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with journalists, human rights organizations, and members of the Black community. Tension hung heavy in the air. Amanda entered the room with sharp, confident eyes. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his face pale but attempting to maintain composure. Beside him was a defense attorney hired by the police department, a lawyer well known for defending officers in controversial cases. Marcus was the first to take the stand. He recounted the incident with a clear, unwavering voice. He emphasized that he had remained calm and complied with all of Ethan's demands. Yet he was still assaulted and humiliated. When Marcus finished his testimony, the courtroom fell silent. Some in the audience couldn't hold back their tears. The defense attempted to shift the narrative, claiming that Marcus had been uncooperative and made the officer feel endangered. But Amanda swiftly countered, presenting the video footage as evidence. She argued that nothing in Marcus's behavior indicated he posed any threat. As the first day of the trial concluded, public outcry intensified outside. the Black community organized a large protest at the courthouse gates, demanding justice not only for Marcus but for all those who had suffered from abuse of power. In the following days, Marcus spent time sharing more of his life story with Amanda and the legal team. He recounted the valuable lessons he had learned during his military service, where he witnessed unity that transcended racial and social boundaries. Marcus spoke of a white comrade, Captain James Miller, who had once saved his life during a dangerous mission in the Middle East. James lived by the belief that all people are equal in the face of adversity. His bravery and compassion profoundly shaped Marcus's view of kindness and humanity. Marcus's story was featured across multiple media outlets, sparking a wave of empathy and support from people everywhere. He became more than a victim. He emerged as a symbol of resilience, courage, and hope. However, the pressure on Marcus also grew. He began receiving anonymous threats via phone calls and letters. Amanda advised him to be cautious, but Marcus remained steadfast. "I've survived battles where my life was on the line. These threats don't scare me," he said resolutely. The fight led by Marcus and Amanda extended far beyond the courtroom. Their story became a catalyst for reform movements within police forces nationwide. Human rights organizations and social activists called on local governments to implement specific changes, including enhanced training for officers on racial bias, establishing independent oversight systems to investigate cases of abuse of power, requiring greater transparency in reporting and handling citizen complaints. Meanwhile, Ethan began to feel isolated, even from his former colleagues. Some supported him, arguing that he was simply doing his job. However, many others, especially younger officers like Daniel Foster, started questioning the system they were serving. One day, Ethan received a letter from his father, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The letter was short but deeply emotional. "You were wrong, Ethan, but your mistakes don't define you. Be brave enough to face the truth." Ethan read the letter over and over, his heart filled with conflicting emotions. He knew he had crossed the line, but fear and pride kept him from confronting the truth. His mind spiraled into turmoil, and for the first time, Ethan began to consider admitting his fault and making a change. The trial continued with clearer evidence being presented. For the first time, Ethan Powell truly felt the weight of his actions as other victims stepped forward to testify. Linda and Jamal, who had both suffered under Ethan's abuse of power, shared their stories in vivid, emotional detail, casting a heavy atmosphere over the courtroom. During a mandatory mediation session, Marcus and Ethan were finally forced to face each other directly. Without lawyers or a crowd present, the small room was silent, leaving only two men with their intertwined histories and prejudices. Ethan was the first to speak, his voice weary yet still tinged with defensiveness. "I didn't think things would go this far. I was just doing my job." Marcus looked directly at Ethan, his gaze no longer angry but calm and steady. "You call that a job? You humiliated me, not because I did anything wrong, but because you saw me as different. Don't you see, Ethan? That very mindset is what makes you part of a much bigger problem." Ethan fell silent, unable to find words to defend himself. Marcus continued, "I'm not here to take revenge on you. I want you to understand that your actions didn't just harm me. They hurt others like me, people without a voice. But you still have a chance to change. We all do." Ethan lowered his head, a sense of guilt beginning to stir within him. The conversation ended without full reconciliation, but it left a deep impression on both men, forcing them to confront truths they could no longer ignore. Marcus's story became the focal point of national media coverage. Human rights organizations, progressive politicians, and even principled police officers began using the lawsuit as a platform to call for reform. Significant changes began to emerge. Workshops on racial bias. Police departments mandated training sessions on bias awareness and equitable treatment. Independent oversight committees. Panels comprising lawyers, social activists, and community members were established to monitor police conduct. Recruitment reforms. Police applicants were required to undergo rigorous psychological evaluations to assess their mindset and character suitability. Meanwhile, Marcus didn't stop at the courtroom. He began organizing talks at schools, churches, and community centers, sharing his story to raise awareness about racial discrimination. He told audiences, "We can't change the past, but we can build a future where our children no longer have to live in fear because of the color of their skin." Marcus's efforts paid off as more people joined the movement. Even young officers like Daniel Foster publicly voiced their support for Marcus and condemned abuses of power within the police force. Meanwhile, Ethan began to confront himself. After his conversation with Marcus, he felt uneasy whenever he recalled his actions. Sleepless nights forced him to question, "Why did I behave that way? What turned me into this kind of person?" Ethan decided to attend therapy sessions, where he started opening up about his troubled childhood and the invisible pressures from his family and society. His therapist encouraged him to write letters to those he had hurt, beginning with Marcus. In his first letter, Ethan wrote, "I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I am truly sorry, not just for you, but for myself. I let fear and prejudice control me for far too long." Marcus received the letter and read it slowly. Though he wasn't entirely convinced of Ethan's transformation, he understood that forgiveness was the first step toward healing. He wrote back, encouraging Ethan to continue on his path of redemption. "We can't erase our mistakes, but we can make the future better. Don't give up." Ethan's family also began to change. Rachel, his wife, supported him in volunteering within the community to atone for his actions. His young son, though still a child, felt proud as he saw his father begin to do the right thing. Though many positive changes had taken place, the journey for Marcus and Ethan was still fraught with challenges. A faction of extremists within the police force, feeling threatened by the reforms, began pushing back. Some veteran officers openly criticized Marcus and the reform movements, claiming they were destroying the honor of the police. One night, Marcus received an anonymous letter containing a threat. "If you don't stop, the consequences won't just be for you." While concerned for his family's safety, Marcus refused to back down. He increased security at his home and continued to attend community events. Ethan, despite his transformation, also faced hostility from some of his former colleagues. They labeled him a traitor, and on one occasion, his car was vandalized while parked. Yet Ethan chose not to let fear deter him. He began collaborating with Marcus at community education events, sharing his story of mistakes and how he learned to change. At a large event, Marcus and Ethan stood on stage together. Ethan held the microphone, his voice shaky but sincere. "I've made mistakes. I'm not proud of what I've done, but I am proud that I now have the chance to make things right. I'm here today to tell everyone that change is possible if we are brave enough to confront the truth." Applause erupted across the room. Marcus placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and smiled. "This is what we're fighting for. Not revenge, but to build a better society." The trial continued under intense tension and growing public attention. The lawyers from both sides delivered their closing arguments. Amanda Rodriguez utilized all the evidence and testimonies she had gathered to demonstrate that Ethan Powell's actions were not just a case of individual misconduct, but a reflection of a racially biased system perpetuated by apathy and silence. She concluded her argument with an emotional plea. "Today, we are not just judging one man. We are judging an ideology, a prejudice that has been deeply ingrained in our society. But justice is not only about punishment. It is about the opportunity for change and healing. I hope this trial becomes a turning point." Ethan's defense attorney attempted to mitigate his actions, arguing that he had acted under the pressures of his job and circumstances. However, this argument failed to convince the jury, especially after they reviewed the video footage from the incident. In the end, the court found Ethan Powell guilty. He was sentenced to 18 months of probation and required to participate in ethical rehabilitation programs. The police department was also ordered to pay significant damages to Marcus and the community. At Marcus's request, the funds were directed toward establishing a non-profit organization dedicated to raising awareness about human rights and advocating for police reform. As Marcus stepped out of the courthouse, he was greeted by a cheering crowd. But he wasn't celebrating. He knew this was only a small victory in a much larger battle. After the trial, Marcus and Ethan's lives took different paths yet remained interconnected. Marcus founded a non-profit organization called Light of Justice, aimed at providing legal support for victims of racial discrimination and police violence. His organization quickly garnered attention and support from the community. Marcus hosted workshops, inviting individuals who had suffered under unjust systems to share their stories. He also collaborated with schools, organizing talks to educate the younger generation about the importance of compassion and equality. Ethan, meanwhile, began his journey of redemption. He attended regular therapy sessions, not only to confront his past mistakes but also to understand the roots of the prejudice he had carried. Ethan volunteered in communities he had once harmed, teaching children basketball, helping repair homes for struggling families, and gradually rebuilding his reputation. One day, Ethan visited Marcus at the office of Light of Justice. Walking in with a sincere expression, he said, "I want to help. If you can trust me, I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Marcus paused, considering, then nodded. "This journey won't be easy, but if you're truly committed to change, there will always be a place for you here." Ethan became one of the organization's first volunteers, participating in workshops and sharing his story to warn others about the consequences of prejudice. As time passed, Light of Justice continued to grow. Marcus and Ethan, once on opposing sides, gradually became allies in a new fight. Together, they traveled across the country, from impoverished neighborhoods in Detroit to schools in the American South, spreading inspiration and encouraging change. One evening, after wrapping up a major event, Ethan and Marcus sat down together. They shared stories about their pasts, the struggles, and the pain both had endured. Ethan stared into the cup of coffee in his hands, his voice reflective. "You know, I used to think I was strong because I had power, but the truth is, I was weak. I let fear control me, and you've shown me that true strength is facing your mistakes." Marcus smiled and replied, "I've had moments when I wanted to give up too, Ethan. But if we don't stand up, who will? What matters is what we learn and how we act on those lessons." In that moment, two men from entirely different worlds found common ground. They not only reconciled with each other but also began to reconcile with themselves. Years later, the story of Marcus and Ethan became a symbol of forgiveness, transformation, and the power of community. Light of Justice expanded beyond national borders, collaborating with international organizations to build a fairer justice system. Marcus, now a renowned speaker, continued to inspire millions with his story. He spoke not only of pain and injustice but also of the power of compassion and forgiveness. Ethan, meanwhile, became a dedicated social activist. He worked tirelessly to educate young police officers about responsibility and ethics in their profession. Ethan was no longer the man he once was. He became a living testament that change is possible. The story concluded with Marcus and Ethan standing together on stage at a major event. Around them were thousands of people of all races and backgrounds, holding hands and chanting a unified message. "We can change, we can heal, and together, we will build a fairer future." The light of hope spread, not just within the auditorium but also into the hearts of all who witnessed it. As Marcus looked out at the crowd, he felt an unwavering belief that this fight, no matter how challenging, would always be worth it.